For the first installment of my Fast Fallacies, where I very quickly outline the critical thinking concepts that we all need to apply to our own thinking in order to notice particularly common ways we might make mistakes, I want to discuss false polarization. Beneath this fallacy, there's another fallacy, that is false dichotomies. I will address this problem in another video, but I think it will actually be useful to skip ahead and talk about the fallacy that already assumes dichotomies. So what's a dichotomy? Well, simply put, it's the notion that things must be either one way or another, black or white, left wing or right wing, right or wrong, male or female, gay or straight, familiar or foreign, conservative or liberal, and etc., on and on. Of course, all of those ways of defining things are often very useful, and there's nothing inherently bad with applying those dichotomies to things. Thoughts, beliefs, and all the people we encounter in the real world often do fall in quite neatly to either one of those categories. But we do have to be critical in how we place them in those categories. In this case, being critical means recognizing that the world is not black and white. It's more like a rainbow, to be poetic about it. It's a spectrum. So when we fail to fully appreciate the fact that extreme cases are not the only way to see things, we tend to commit the fallacy of false polarization. In addition, where we ourselves stand in relationship to another person, idea, or belief has a powerful psychological effect on how we see those things. The most blatant and obvious example is how people often call other people who happen to disagree with them Nazis, or Hitler lovers, or Hitler even, they might even say, "You're Hitler." So obviously there's nothing wrong with understanding that Hitler and the Nazis were the most politically and socially evil people in the history of the modern world. But to call anyone who disagrees with us, where we assume that our position is the opposite of evil, that is, where we assume that we're absolutely right, to call anyone who disagrees with us a Nazi is to commit false polarization. And this problem is so common that the general consensus on the internet is that anyone who resorts to even comparing anyone to a Nazi must have poor reasoning skills. Of course, that ignores the fact that there may be certain people who we can reasonably compare to Nazis, but that's a digression. For now, please recognize there are many extreme poles that we tend to apply to people, thoughts, and beliefs that may not be reasonable. For example, and this is just one of thousands of potential cases, think of the way some people claim that anyone who ever smoked marijuana is a criminal or a pothead or a general waste of life. This extreme characterization ignores the fact that some, if not most people, who have touched that drug have been merely experimenting, and it may have been simply a youthful indiscretion. Politicians have often fallen victim to this kind of false polarization. But it's important to note that anyone who themselves has ever made the mistake of doing drugs probably won't be guilty of thinking this way. Where we ourselves stand on an issue often defines where we see other people on the spectrum between right and wrong. A more everyday, common way that this happens is when we assume that anyone who happens to be just a little bit more conservative or just a little bit more liberal than ourselves is actually an extreme conservative or an extreme liberal. Please think back to the last time you argued with someone who had a different viewpoint than you on, say, abortion, or sexism, or racism, or welfare. I'm almost certain that you started to treat them as if they believed in the extreme version of the position you were against, instead of recognizing that you both might have actually shared many beliefs, and that only a few critical points regarding how you saw the world were at odds with how they saw the world. Now, the sad and dangerous thing is that many people also falsely polarize themselves, and this is a very common problem among angry young people, or just simply confused young people. If a person happens to share a few of the views that extreme liberals or extreme conservatives hold, they may make the mistake of embracing all the extreme views held by such people. In this way, a person who has had several unpleasant experiences with people who are, say, homosexual, may embrace all the biases and all the arguments that homophobic people have. And in this way, a person who has had several unpleasant experiences with people who are black, for instance, may embrace all the arguments and all the biases that white supremacists hold. They may even go so far as to call themselves Nazis. And in this way, a person who has had several unpleasant experiences with men, for instance, may embrace all the biases and all the arguments that misandrists hold. A misandrist is somebody who hates men. And yet again, in this way, a person who has had several unpleasant experiences with feminists, for instance, may embrace all the biases and all the arguments that misogynists, those are women haters, that they hold. And yet again, in this way, a person who has had several unpleasant experiences with Christianity, for instance, may embrace Satan worship as a way of life. Now, if you're nodding your head to all those examples, please listen carefully. In all of those cases, we ourselves may be making a serious mistake if we assume that a person who has a few critical things to say about gay people, or black people, or feminists, or men, or Christianity, if we assume that they have actually embraced any of those extreme versions of those ways of thinking. It's not necessarily the case that anybody who has something critical to say against gay people is homophobic. Please recognize this. Being critical is not the same thing as being outright against. And likewise with black people. Thomas Sowell, the black sociologist, an African American, has many things to say that are critical of black culture. He's clearly not a racist. So don't push people to the extreme end of the poles, of the pole between right and wrong, the pole between what you believe in and what you don't believe in. It could just be that somebody has a few critical things to say, and they are by no means either black or white. They may be somewhere in the gray. Please see that it is fully and actually most commonly possible that people who hold a few beliefs we disagree with are not homophobic, they are not racist, they are not women haters, and they are not men haters, and they are not Satan worshippers, or any of the extreme versions of the positions that we happen to disagree with. So in one way, we have to be careful and critical to not let ourselves take extreme positions, but also to not assume that someone who disagrees with us has adopted an extreme position for themselves. Please understand that people may have a few critical remarks to make about what you accept to be true about race or sex or culture or religion or beliefs or anything. And yet that does not mean that they are horrible, evil monsters that you need to attack as if they're the reincarnation of Hitler, for example. Well, of course, it's very hard to be this critical in regards to beliefs that society has told us are absolutely wrong or absolutely right, that are absolutely black and absolutely white. This brings us to another fallacy, and that's the bandwagon effect. That's going to be discussed in another video. I hope this was useful for you, and I hope you will turn a critical eye towards yourself, especially the next time you're arguing with somebody, and realize just because they disagree with you doesn't mean that they are the extreme version of a person you might disagree with. Thanks for listening. This is James Possum. This was my first installment of Fast Fallacies, the polarization effect, what I thought was the most important one to discuss. Until next time, be critical.